The river ran black that night, not with water but with something heavier, viscous, clinging to the mossy stones. A child's scream echoed along the banks of Red Hollow, a town that seemed ordinary in daylight, quaint even, but in the shadows of its Victorian homes and crooked churches, something unspeakable festered. A widow known only as Madame Vexley sat in the attic of her mansion, eyes fixed on a candle that flickered like a dying heartbeat. She had summoned her strongest slave from the fields to her home. Her daughters, 6 in number, watched with a mixture of awe and terror. What she intended would leave marks not on the flesh alone, but on the soul of a town, and for generations, it would remain a secret. No one spoke of Red Hollow in polite company, and no map showed the town's crooked streets. Yet records suggested the Vexleys' influence had stretched far, shaping orphanages, seminaries, even city councils. And beneath it all, a single, horrifying purpose: to create the perfect bloodline. Madame Vexley was a widow long before the town whispered her name. Her husband, a stern preacher, died under circumstances some whispered were unnatural. She inherited his estate, his authority, and his obsession with lineage. In private journals discovered decades later, hidden in the walls of her mansion, she wrote of perfection. Strength must be woven into flesh, intelligence into marrow, beer into the veins. These words reveal not madness alone, but deliberate intent. She selected her daughters, each marked by different traits she deemed essential: cunning, beauty, obedience, vitality. And she selected a slave from the nearby plantations, a man whose physical and mental fortitude surpassed any ordinary laborer. In her warped vision, he was the key to genetic transcendence, a living instrument in her alchemy of blood. Red Hollow was not on any map for long. By the early 1900s, census records show a small town of 32 families, where everyone knew everyone, and yet no one truly knew anything. The town church rang its bell faithfully, calling children to prayers they did not fully understand. Orphanages received donations from the Vexleys, and teachers reported strange patterns in certain children, ones with oddly calculated intellect or a disturbing lack of empathy. Rumors of disappearances drifted like mist over the town, children gone without trace, servants vanishing during harvest. But citizens feared the Vexleys too much to ask questions. Every family owed something: debt, allegiance, or shame to the widow's influence, and she thrived in this silence, her experiments hidden behind lace curtains and iron gates. He was known as Elijah, though his name might have been lost to history, and he was remarkable not only for his strength, but for a stoicism that unnerved even hardened overseers. He had endured more than any human should, yet there was a spark of defiance in his eyes, a memory of freedom that never fully faded. Madame Vexley recognized this immediately. To her, he was not a man but a vessel. In her journals, she described him as the seed of eternity, writing of the necessity to bind his essence to her daughters, so that nature may bend to the will of reason. Elijah did not speak of resistance. The Vexley mansion was a prison of terror. The walls themselves seemed alive, whispering threats in the flicker of candlelight. And yet, there were moments when he watched her daughters sleep and felt a protective human urge, fleeting but potent. The first night was ritualistic. The mansion smelled of candle wax, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. Madame Vexley instructed her daughters to lie in a circle on the cold oak floor. Elijah, trembling yet forced into compliance, understood this was the beginning of a cycle that would warp every life in the house. The widow circled them, murmuring chants that twisted Latin and English into a private, horrifying liturgy. She spoke of blood as memory and flesh as truth. No screams escaped. The daughters had been trained for silence, for endurance. Yet, in the attic, unseen by the participants, the house groaned as if anticipating the unnatural acts that would bind its tenants to a dark legacy. This night was only the first of many, and its memory would haunt the town for decades. Across town, the Red Hollow orphanage received children whose families had mysteriously died or disappeared. Many were brought under the Vexleys' patronage. Here the influence of Madame Vexley spread quietly. Children who resembled the widow's daughters in thought or behavior were noted, encouraged, or removed entirely. A young girl, Clara, remembered years later in her memoirs of cold hallways and whispers. The ladies watched you, even when they smiled. Their eyes measured not kindness, but worth. The orphanage functioned as a satellite for the widow's experiments, a place where the next generation could be shaped, tested, and sometimes erased. Secrets lingered in every corner, every locked door, and every ledger. The town church was more than a spiritual home, it was a tool of control. Madame Vexley influenced sermons, confessions, and marriages, embedding her philosophy into every moral lesson. Parishioners found themselves obeying laws and customs they barely understood, feeling guilt and obligation in ways they could not name. Behind stained glass windows, she met with clergy sympathetic to her aims, sharing journals of observation and insight about her daughter's progress. The church became both a sanctuary and a cage, a symbol of sanctity corrupted by hidden designs. Madame Vexley was not content with physical control alone. She studied psychology, superstition, and folklore, blending them into a doctrine of fear. Her daughters were taught that obedience was not merely survival, but a sacred duty. Punishments were ceremonial, often subtle, leaving deep mental scars. Yet her influence reached beyond her household. Townsfolk who questioned her methods were ostracized or vanished quietly. Children of the orphanage began exhibiting behaviors that unnerved outsiders: excessive mimicry, sudden fits of rage, eerie intellect beyond years. Fear, she understood, was a tool as potent as any whip or chain. Years passed. One daughter gave birth, then another. Each child carried traits Madame Vexley deemed essential. They were tall, sharp-eyed, and unnervingly self-aware for their age. The town whispered about the Vexley children, noting their unusual abilities and cold demeanor. Families who hosted them remarked on a strange magnetic pull. Children who commanded attention, evoking fear and admiration simultaneously. Yet no one truly connected the dots. The widow's imperfection through selective lineage was manifesting, but at a cost invisible to outsiders: shattered minds, broken families, and a pervasive sense of doom. Decades later, a local historian uncovered fragments of the Vexley journals, bound in human skin, scrawled in ink that seemed to shimmer in candlelight. They documented rituals, observations, and genealogical records in horrifying detail. The historian noted patterns, disappearances aligned with the widow's experiments. Behavioral anomalies matched her predictions, and entire town networks had been influenced without anyone realizing. As he read, he felt a creeping dread, as if the widow herself watched from the margins of history. The journal suggested that Red Hollow's calm, orderly streets had been a facade for decades of deliberate, systematic control. Children vanished. Servants vanished. Occasionally, even a town official failed to return home. Records were either destroyed or misfiled under innocuous terms, but whispers persisted, passed down from one generation to the next. Beware the Vexley line. It was said that anyone who probed too deeply into their history felt sudden illness, a creeping paralysis of mind and body. Some claimed to see shadows in the windows of the abandoned mansion long after the family line supposedly ended. Others reported hearing chanting, low and rhythmic, echoing from the cellar of ruins. The mansion stands abandoned, a blackened silhouette against the moonlight. Ivy creeps across shattered windows, and the air reeks of damp wood and decay. Locals speak of strange lights and murmurs at night. Paranormal investigators, historians, and thrill-seekers have all entered, yet few leave with coherent testimony. Those who survive speak of nausea, disorientation, and unshakable unease. It is as if the house remembers, its walls saturated with decades of ritual, fear, and manipulation. Genealogists attempting to trace the Vexley descendants encounter roadblocks. Families report peculiar traits: precocious intelligence, eerie physical resilience, and, in some cases, disturbing psychological patterns. It is impossible to separate myth from reality, but DNA fragments suggest continuity. The widow's experiment may have extended far beyond Red Hollow. Some descendants reportedly avoid reproduction, others cling to secrecy, perpetuating the cycle of fear she initiated. Madame Vexley's daughters carried scars unseen. Their children, too, displayed behaviors that were either genius or monstrosity. Letters, diaries, and oral histories depict a legacy of obsession, guilt, and anxiety. One diary entry reads, "We were bred to obey, to be perfect, but I cannot escape the hunger in me, nor the shame of my mother's designs." Trauma, in this sense, became a hereditary artifact, passed down alongside genetic traits. Red Hollow eventually faded from prominence. Census records show decline. Businesses shuttered. Families moved away, yet local legend endured. Older residents speak in hushed tones, warning outsiders of meddling with what is better left buried. The town's silence is not peaceful, it is imposed, heavy and oppressive, a collective obedience born of fear and survival instinct. Excavations around the mansion have uncovered strange artifacts, bones arranged in geometric patterns, personal items of unknown origin, and fragments of clothing suggesting ritualistic activity. Carbon dating aligns them with the widow's era. Scholars are divided. Some claim these are remnants of folklore, others suggest evidence of systematic, premeditated horror. The findings challenge assumptions about morality, humanity, and the limits of control. Madame Vexley's journals reveal recurring motifs: spirals, triangles, and repeated numbers tied to birth, death, and ritual. Scholars argue these symbols encoded psychological triggers designed to condition children and servants alike. The widow's genius was not in overt violence alone, but in subtle orchestration, embedding fear and control into language, geometry, and daily routine. Surviving descendants report recurring nightmares, unexplainable strength, or intelligence beyond what they can account for. One recalls a voice whispering, "Perfection requires obedience." Another remembers being compelled to perform rituals without understanding why. These accounts suggest a multi-generational imprint and inheritance of both blood and trauma. Churches, orphanages, and civic institutions were silently co-opted by Madame Vexley's influence. Her reach demonstrates the danger of unchecked power, illustrating how one individual's obsession can warp an entire community. The moral decay was subtle, embedded in policy, charity, and education. rather than overt criminality. The story of Madame Vexley ends not with closure but with lingering dread. Her mansion rots, her journals remain partially hidden, and her descendants walk unseen among us. The town of Red Hollow no longer exists on maps, yet the echoes of fear, control, and obsession ripple outward. Some secrets, the historian notes, are too dangerous to uncover fully, but to look away is also to inherit a fragment of a terror. And so, the bloodline persists in memory, in flesh, and in the shadows of forgotten towns.